Hi, everyone. Hi. I'm Eric Duran, the head naturalist at the Nature Discovery Center. I've been, like she said, I've been there about 17 years. But I have been a naturalist and worked in some field or another of wildlife biology or science education for 30 years now. So my background is mostly in herpetology, ornithology, and entomology. That's what I've done most of my field work in, usually just identifying things, nothing super scientific, just what's on the land that I'm working on. And I also love gardening, so I keep up some of the beautiful gardens at the Nature Center. I love to go out and photograph insects with my phone, much to the chagrin of my friends who are trying to do other things, and then put them in iNaturalist, identify them, and put them into different projects. So we're a small nature park. We're only about 4 acres. Really, the habitat's really only about 3.5 acres in Bellaire. If any of you used to go to T's Nursery, then you drove right by it, and you may not have even known you drove by it. It's just down Newcastle there. And it was an estate. There's a small house there. Well, actually, it's a pretty big house. But there's an old house there, and there's about 3.5 acres, 4 acres with the parking lots. What we've tried to do for the past 30 years is to try to turn it from a giant yard into a series of small native habitats. But this is a story about how using native plants in a space can greatly increase the insect biodiversity of that place. And of course, if you increase the insect biodiversity of a given area, because you have used native plants in the and you guys like native plants, you know the story, that when you increase insects, you can also increase the biodiversity of those creatures that feed on insects. So even if you're not into insects, you are helping other animals by helping insects. We're going to talk today mainly about pollinators, and some of the creatures I show you today are not strictly taking nectar and accidentally getting pollen on them. Some of them are also feeding on pollen itself, and some of these creatures also are predatory on other creatures and also are drinking nectar and eating pollen. So some of these animals are going to be strictly pollinators, and then some of them are not strictly pollinators, and we'll talk about some of those. I'm also going to show you just maybe a couple of creatures that you often see in flowers, and you might think this creature's a pollinator, but they're not significantly a pollinator, in that they don't move around between flowers enough, even though they might be hanging out in flowers. So everybody, I work at a place called the Nature Discovery Center, which is in a 4-acre park in Bellaire, Texas. And this is what our entrance looks like. I want to give a couple of shout outs before I get too much underway. So bear with me, because we're starting a little bit late. That's what the front of our park looks like. You can tell that we're very dedicated to native wildflowers. We love wildflowers there. We don't mow our lawns this time of year. We have done as the best that we can to get rid of non-natives. It's an uphill battle, but we do the best we can using a variety of techniques. And we just plant, we seed. We buy plants from you guys sometimes, from the Arboretum, from Audubon, from a variety of places. So we buy plants, we seed, and our wildflower gardens are looking really phenomenal this year. And that's what our front entrance looks like right now. And I also want to give a shout out. So Marianne Boschman has been a naturalist at the Nature Center. She worked there for something like 35 years and only recently retired, and now she is traveling around. But she is the person most responsible, if you've ever met Marianne or heard her name, she is very strict about native plants in the park. And another person who encouraged us to be very strict about native plants in the park is standing in the back corner of the room checking her phone right now. Her name is Linda Knowles, and she has been for a very long time someone who has helped the Nature Center find out which plants are native, which ones are not. She's given us several plants, so I'm going to give my own round of applause to Linda Knowles. Linda, I love you. Thank you. She's a bulldog, and we love it. All right, next slide, please. Okay. And if you do the forward, no, back. Oh, you have it. Just make sure that it's paused and that it's not on automatic. That's perfect. There's my friend Marianne Boschman right there. So we're a nature center. We're in a public park, but we bought the land in the first place. We gave it to the city of Bellaire, and we run the park as a nature center. So the primary purpose of this park, it was the first public park in the city of Bellaire, has It wasn't originally, it was supposed to be a park, but we slowly took it over and turned it into a nature center, and the city of Bellaire is very happy about that, actually. They don't have to do too much management. We do all the land management. And so what we do is we do a lot of everything you could think of from an education standpoint that a nature center does. We lead people on nature hikes, I give presentations, I teach preschoolers about snakes and lizards and roly-polies and stuff like that. Marianne Boschman does a lot of birding activities and does a lot of native plant-related activities. Next slide, please. We are a very popular bird watching destination. Anybody know what bird that is? Debbie, don't say it. Blackburnian warbler. That's a male Blackburnian warbler. Even though we're a tiny postage stamp, there's just something about this green rectangle in the middle of a bunch of homes and buildings and businesses that really attracts the birds. So we regularly have walks during this time. We are in the middle of spring migration right now, and we're a very popular bird watching destination. In the winter, historically, we've been a very popular destination for winter hummingbirds, but we think local land changes, they've kind of disappeared. But you could have seen 5 or 6 species of winter hummingbirds, all of which were like far western species, that you could see right there in Bellaire in our park. And it's kind of sad that, again, land changes have kind of driven them closer to the coast and they don't come inland anymore. Next slide, please. One of the things that we regularly have in the park, of course, are nesting screech owls. So as you may know, bat houses are not really a thing, but you can put them up if you really want to. But what we do get is we get a lot of, we have a pretty good population of nesting screech owls. Of course, that's a non-migratory creature that stays in the park. Next slide, please. This is kind of the entrance to our pocket prairie. I don't remember who all had, do you guys know Don Verser? You all know Don Verser, right? Yeah, he's involved in this group. Don helped us establish a pocket prairie along with probably Linda and Lan Shen and a lot of other people from this particular group and from some other groups. They went out and did prairie plant rescues, which is, you know, an area is about to be plowed under. They go dig up the plants and they planted them here. So we didn't buy those plants. We planted our prairie from prairies that now no longer exist. So a lot of this comes from, was it Psalms Prairie that was destroyed? There's a bunch of different locations. But we maintain a series of small ecosystems in the park. So we have a small pocket prairie, we have an eastern woodland section, we have a pretty good sized pond, we have a low wetland area, and we try to plant native plants or seed native plants into these areas that would belong in those particular ecosystems. They're like mini ecosystems. Next slide, please. But that's not what you're here today. I just wanted to let you, know about the Nature Discovery Center in Russ Pittman Park in Bellaire. But let's get started because we're starting a little late with our pollinators. Of course, we all know about bees and butterflies, right? I don't want to stick to bees and butterflies. I want to talk to you about things that you don't want to hear about. So we're going to move on to those in a bit. But I do want to start off with a group that you know pretty well. Does anybody know what kind of bee that is?
Bombus pennsylvanicus.
It is the American bumblebee. I'm going to speak English for those of you who don't speak Latin. And in nomine Patri Filii Sancti, Amen. This is the American bumblebee, and this used to be in the eastern United States the most common bumblebee. But in the past 20 years, its population has dropped by 90%, especially in the Northeast. So this thing, now down here in the South, it doesn't seem to have suffered quite as much, but it has really suffered from overdevelopment and use of neonicotinoid pesticides, as have a lot of these creatures. One of the reasons why it's important to use native plants and to help protect these animals in your own garden is because we are right now in the middle of what some people call like an insect Armageddon. The numbers of insects worldwide has dropped precipitously over the past 25 years. And so they need these little oases that we create in our yards and our parks next to buildings and hospitals and things like that. So this is probably the only bumblebee that we see in Russ Pittman Park. A lot of bumblebees nest underground, but and they are eusocial animals, so that means they have a queen. But the males, instead of flying off, mating, and dying the way that honeybees do, the males stick around and help take care of the nest as well. So there's usually a founder bumblebee who's a queen from the previous season. and she finds a place. Now, this particular species of bumblebee is well known for making their nests in old coolers, boots, foot lockers, in spaces in between sheds outside. So these creatures, or they will find old mouse burrows or things like that. So they don't dig themselves like some digging bees do. They find pre-existing cavities, holes, things like that are close to the ground, and they make their nests in there. Next slide, please. Ooh, we're getting on to the leafcutter bees. Now, I have so many things that I did make myself an outline so I would remember everything. So we're starting with the carpenter bees now. Does anyone know carpenter bees? Have you guys ever heard of them? Now, they may be your bane, too, because if you have anything made out of wood in your backyard, they're called carpenter bees because they make holes in wood. Often these long tunnels. There are some, depending on the species, they make different shaped tunnels. And some of them are more solitary than others. This one is a relatively rare one. We're kind of on the eastern edge of its range. This is more of a western, southwestern bee. It's called Strand's carpenter bee. It's a very hairy little bee. You notice that they have very strong looking mandibles up front for digging these holes into wood. Next slide, please. And the males of this species are somewhat golden. I hope that shows up in this picture, but it really stands out amongst the bees. So here's another carpenter bee. This is probably the most common one. This in our area, but also throughout the eastern United States. It's called the eastern carpenter bee. I want you guys to notice something. It's a big, robust-looking bee, and often on the front part of the bee, it's pretty furry. And so a lot of people, when they see these, think that they're bumblebees. But a big difference is that the abdomen of a bumblebee is very furry, whereas the abdomen of carpenter bees is naked. It's just shiny. There's no fur on the abdomen of carpenter bees.
Black, like blue-black.
It'll be blue-black. There are different species, though. This is probably the furriest of our large carpenter bees, the eastern carpenter bee. What did I want to tell you about this one? So these are, this particular one is not a solitary one. They will nest in a little colony. Each individual female might make her own holes in the wood. These nest in my backyard in the fence. And then they come out and they go to all the flowers. This is the most common bee in my backyard, actually, right now. And it's one of the most common at the Nature Center, too. But they'll usually a male will hang around in the front, and he'll just kind of hang out very disconcertingly at face level, and he'll even come up and check you out sometimes and then fly away. And you can spot the males because they have a white mark on their forehead. So this is obviously a female right here. And they'll kind of patrol the front of the colony, and they'll stay out front, and they'll even sleep at night sometimes outside of the colony hanging onto a plant. So you'll find them gripped onto a plant with their mandibles and kind of sleeping there. The females are down in the holes laying eggs. There's usually a dominant female, and depending on the species, and depending sometimes even on the situation, sometimes the dominant female is the only one laying eggs and having young. Sometimes subordinate females are also laying eggs and having young, but she gets the prime choice of burrow space and flowers and things like that. Next slide, please. This is one with a ridiculously long name. This is the horsefly-like carpenter bee. So if you're in a play and you're about to go on stage and you need to practice oral exercises, horsefly-like carpenter bee, horsefly-like carpenter bee, watermelon, watermelon, watermelon. Some of you were not in theater and it shows. But if this is the horsefly-like carpenter bee, and it's a smaller carpenter bee. They tend not to have as much hair on their bodies, although you can see just a little bit. And I want to tell you a whole bunch of facts about it, but guess what? You start looking around, there aren't that many facts about it. So people have not done a lot of research on exactly how they're nesting, what they're foraging on. But we see this one a lot in the Nature Center, and it's a smaller. So carpenter bees can be about that size, and this is kind of a smaller one, the horsefly-like carpenter bee. Next slide, please. And there's a horsefly-like carpenter bee up close, and you can see those big mandibles that it can chew through wood with. Next slide, please. The next one is the southern carpenter bee, and they do have a little bit of fur on them, but they tend to just be shiny blue-black. And sometimes some of the females of the eastern carpenter bee look very much like this, and it can be hard to tell them apart in person unless you look at teeny tiny little details that we're not going to get into here, like is there fur on this part of the leg, or is there an extra part to the mandibles, and we're not here for that. So usually if you see a shiny blue-black large bee, it is the southern carpenter bee, and actually the telltale thing is that those really furry lower tarsi on the legs. Next slide, please. Okay, we're leaving the carpenter bees and we're getting into a non-native bee, but it's the most common bee that you're going to see around. What bee is this? The Western or European honeybee. I feel like you can find out a lot about this bee, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. Next slide, please. Now, that one, kind of shiny black. It's got kind of a naked abdomen, looks kind of like a carpenter bee. That is the Carpenter-mimic leafcutter bee. Carpenter-mimic leafcutter bee. And so, of course, the leafcutter bees are bees that will either nest in holes that have already been made by, say, carpenter bees or other insects in wood or in plant stems. Some species chew a hole themselves into plant stems, and then they fly off. And by the way, this can take up to 2 hours for them to create one little cocoon for their babies. What they'll do is, if you ever walk around sometimes outside, sometimes you'll notice a half circle cut out of leaves, especially, do any of you have any red bud on your property? You'll often see these half circles cut out of red bud. It's not the only plant that they do this to. They do it to a lot of plants. But those are leafcutter bees. And what they'll do is they'll land on the leaf and then they'll just spin around, chewing the whole time, and then they fall with a piece of leaf and then start flying during the fall. What they're doing with those leaves is they're going back to whatever hole they've either created or found, and they're making a little cocoon. And if it's a space that's already sort of cylindrical, all they have to do is wallpaper it. And they'll wallpaper it with these little half circles of leaf. They'll chew the edges of the leaf so that it's kind of gummy, and it'll all stick together and make a tube. There are some species that actually use like petals. Evening primroses are very popular for the petal users. And they'll make this little tube. They'll go gather nectar and pollen, and they'll put it at the bottom of the little tube. They'll lay an egg on it, and then they'll seal it off with a piece of cut leaf. Then they'll create a little wall, and they'll do it again. They'll create a wall, do it again, create a wall. And so if there's a large shaft, there might be up to 6 bees all in that shaft, larval bees that are in their little things. Now, this species is known to just do it anywhere. So I just saw, there was a mail carrier in Florida who opened up a big mail slot at a business, and in between the letters, one of these female Carpenter-mimic leafcutter bees was just stuffing her little leaf-made cocoons down between the mail. So this particular species is not actually very picky. Some of the others are. Next slide, please. Which one? So this is the flat-tail leafcutter bee. But most of the time when you have leafcutter bees, you really just know, you're looking down at it and you know, I have something in the genus Megachile. They're very hard to tell apart from each other. So most of the time you know that you just have one of these. One of the best ways to learn these, by the way, you can get the bee book in front of you. There's 3 really good bee books for North America, but I would use iNaturalist, actually. One of the best ways that you can learn bees is by snapping photos with your phone and then putting it in iNaturalist. But most of these, the leafcutter bees in this genus, this is what most of them look like, right? A little bit of hair. You can see those stripes on the abdomen right there. A lot of times the differences between the species are things you have to look up very closely, and sometimes you can't even tell just by looking. You would honestly have to kill it and then look at it under a microscope, and we're not going to do that here. But a lot of these leafcutter bees, like the flat-tailed leafcutter bee, which is very common in our park, loves chewing holes in stems. So anything that has a stem with a really soft pith in the middle, or that hollows out naturally on its own, they love chewing in there, and they'll stick their little leaf cocoon down in those holes that they themselves chew. Again, some of them like finding old holes that somebody else made, but they love chewing holes in stems. Next slide, please. There's a group of leafcutter bees that are called the sharptails, and they're also called cuckoo bees. But there's also another group called the cuckoo bees. You guys know what cuckoos do to other birds, right? They're nest parasites. So they'll lay their egg in another bird's nest, and when the cuckoo hatches out, it kicks the other chicks or eggs out of the nest, and the parents take care of the cuckoo baby. The cuckoo mother, she's off somewhere, right? So they don't actually take care of their own kids. So I have a family like that, but we're not going to talk about it. Actually, that's both sides of the family. But what these bees do is they find other bees, like other leafcutter bees sometimes. They find other leafcutter bees, and that sharp abdomen? They'll stick it down into the hole where the little leafy cocoon is, and they'll lay the egg down in the folds of the cut leaves, and when the baby hatches out, it goes in, when the larva hatches out, it goes in and it eats the larva from the other leafcutter bee, and then eats all the nectar and pollen. And somehow, these bees also know they will lay male larvae on male larvae of other species and females on other females. I'm not 100% sure I understand what that's about. Okay, next slide, please. There's also a group of bees that visits the park fairly often called the pebble bees. Pebble bees. And so what they do is they're kind of related. Have you guys ever heard of the mason bees? Mason bees use mud and chewed up plant material to make little walls inside of pre-existing holes that other animals have made. This group actually, they're really excellent at masonry. They find pebbles and they exude and they'll use plant resins as well as kind of this nasty substances out of their own. They're not nasty, it's nature. And as well as stuff that they exude out of their own mouth, and they'll lay their eggs down in those holes, they'll put the nectar and the pollen in, and then they'll make like a little tiny brick wall out of pebbles. And they'll put their babies in there. I see these most often actually on, can you tell what flower that is? Of course you can.
Gaillardia.
Yeah, good, Gaillardia, yeah, Indian blanket. I don't know why, but I see them most often on Gaillardia. Next slide, please. Gaillardia. These are sweat bees. And the reason why this family are called sweat bees is that some of the smaller black species are known to land on you and sop up sweat off of your skin. When I was guiding in Ecuador, whenever we would go up into the bird watching towers that were above the tree line, you could not stand up there for more than 5 minutes because they started getting into your eyes, and they would sop up the tears out of the corners of your eyes, and they would try to land on your eye and lick up the tear solution, the saline solution off the surface of your eyes. The ones we're going to look at, now there are in Russ Pittman Park and probably in your backyard tons of teeny little black things that visit your flowers that you probably never notice, and a lot of those are small, like teeny tiny little sweat bees. But I want to talk about the ones that you do notice, and these are the metallic green sweat bees. So the first one we're looking at is the brown-winged striped sweat bee. And they nest underground. They will often nest in groups together, but they're not colonial, social, the way that like honeybees are, right? There's no queen, they're just nesting in a big group together to look out for nest parasites, which are often other bees or certain kinds of wasps, right? And so these bees I often see in big open flowers that are pink for some reason. I see them on a lot of pink flowers, but I also see them on goldenrod quite a lot. I know goldenrod probably annoys some of you, but if you try to grow it in your yard, right? Because it just starts taking an area over. But I see so many pollinators on goldenrod. It is so rich with nectar, and I've seen such an incredible diversity just on one plant sometimes. And so they also will visit those as well. Next slide, please. This is one that's actually in a totally different genus, but it's kind of closely related. This is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service photo, but it's so good. I love this photo because he's just absolutely covered. He's lost in the sauce right there. Absolutely covered in pollen. This is called the metallic epauletted sweat bee. So somewhere on the top of its wings are these things that look like epaulets to somebody, but I didn't get a great picture of that. So these guys nest alone underground. They really like sandy soil, and I see these guys in tie vine a lot. So you know that species of morning glory that kind of grows close to the ground, triloba, the one with the leaves kind of like that. You'll see those really often in tie vine. They just absolutely love it. You'll see them tumbling around in there, getting totally lost in them. And obviously this one is sitting probably in the top of a sunflower or something like that as well. So these are lone nesters. You don't find them in little groups or colonies together. You just find them sort of where there's sandy soil. One of them over here, maybe one away, and they make a very unique nesting system with one long shaft with a bunch of branches off, and each little branching shaft has its own baby down at the bottom. So that's it for bees. We're going to move on to beetles now. Next, please. I thought it was going to be, but there was one more picture of the same bee. Next, please. Do you guys recognize that beetle? I know some of you don't like this beetle, but I love this beetle. This is a small beetle, and of course, this is called the spotted cucumber beetle. And the cucumber beetles are known to really devastate plants that are cucurbits, right? That are in the squash and gourd family. But they're just adorable. I mean, he doesn't look adorable right there, I know, but I just think they're adorable little beetles. We get them on all kinds of flowers. I see them quite a lot on mist flower and other things that are sort of open and shaggy like that. So it's not them. These guys, I think as adults, will eat nectar, pollen, and they're predatory on other small insects. But their larvae are known to just absolutely devastate the roots, stems, all parts of different melons and squashes and things like that. Next slide, please. That's not the only cucumber beetle, though. I think this one is really beautiful. This one is the banded cucumber beetle. And then the next slide is the striped cucumber beetle, which if you've ever seen a cucumber beetle, the spotted one is small enough. So I just want to remind you, not every small beetle with spots on it is a ladybug, right? So I see a lot of kids when we're hiking will think that's a ladybug, but the ladybugs are actually not pollinators. Sometimes they're incidental pollinators because they'll be looking for small insects in a flower, and then they'll fly over and they will do a little bit of pollination, and they'll occasionally eat a little bit of pollen. They're not big nectar eaters, but they'll occasionally eat pollen. But I didn't include ladybugs in this talk because they're not normally pollinators. And that's the striped cucumber beetle that's right over there that's even smaller than the spotted. And we get all three in our park. We get all three in this area. Next slide, please. Do you guys know this one? Have you ever seen this in your yard? Now this one loves eating fruit more than anything else, but they like big open flowers, and I most often see them in magnolia flowers. So this is the green June beetle. It's very similar to another beetle that really you don't start seeing until you get to the west side of town, and then you go out to the southwest, and that's called the fig eater. And both of these beetles are known to, they like overly ripe fruit or rotten fruit that's fallen to the ground, but they will also get in really large open flowers and feed. We get these in really big numbers. Next slide, please. In the nature center, and for some reason they always come out inside of our rabbit cage outside. They're under the ground and then they just come up, and I have to go in the rabbit cage every day and open it and let them out because they're too big to fit through the little holes of the rabbit cage and get out. I think they're awesome. I love beetles, actually. You know how you're plant people. When you find like a new wildflower and it's something you've only seen in a book. When I see a beetle, I get so excited I fall on the ground and I giggle. All right, I love beetles. Next, I have an inordinate fondness for beetles. So this slide so this is another beetle which I have actually noticed has greatly increased in the Houston area over the past few years, and I'm not sure why at all. They really love sunflowers and other composites. This is the margined leatherwing beetle. And this time of year, if you'll walk along White Oak Bayou in the Heights where I live, they're mating on every plant everywhere. It's indecent and disgusting. But this is the time of year where they're mating, and you'll just see them throughout the summer and into the fall. Next slide, please. So everything I'm showing you, again, is a nectar and pollen eater for the most part. This one right here is an insect I saw literally an hour ago outside in front of this building. Not the one in this picture, but this species is called the sand chafer, and it's another species of scarab, like that June beetle that we saw before. And it's a pretty nondescript beetle, but some people mistake them for the invasive Japanese beetle. So one of the other names of the sand chafer, AKA rose chafer, is the ridiculous name of the false Japanese beetle. What? Okay. Next slide, please. This is another one which you can see regularly in this nature center where you are right now. We don't get them commonly, but this is one of my favorite beetles because it's been marked with this really cool thing on the front. That's called a delta flower scarab. Now some of these big fat scarabs like the sand chafer and the delta flower beetle, delta flower scarab, sometimes they don't do a great job of pollination because they will stay in the flower sometimes and just eat the entire flower. So I'm not sure what makes them stay longer sometimes and then fly off other times. A lot of these flower scarabs too, these bigger beetles, the green one, the sand chafer, this one we just saw, sometimes they'll overnight in the flower. So it would be like if you crawled into a pizza oven and spent the night there, right, on top of the pizza. So sometimes they'll just sleep in the flower that they're eating overnight, and you'll find them there first thing in the morning if you go out sometimes. I think it's a really beautiful beetle. Next slide, please. So this is another one of those things that you may have walked by this hundreds and hundreds of times when you walk by wildflowers. I see these on fleabane a lot, but they're on all kinds of, they like kind of platform flowers, right? So I see these on fleabane. I see these a lot on sunflowers. I see them on different species of Rudbeckia, Gaillardia as well. These are called the tumbling flower beetles, and they're super, super tiny. Super tiny. So it just looks like a little dot. And then one day I saw one hop and I was like, what was that hopping dot? So the tumbling flower beetles, these teeny tiny little beetles, so this one's in the genus Mordella right here. It doesn't really have a common name. Do you see that projection off the end right there of the abdomen that's sticking off? They will take that and they'll flick it up against whatever they're sitting on, and they'll just rocket themselves off of whatever flower they're on if they get surprised, and then they just sort of look like they're tumbling down to the ground. So this is probably one of the most common ones, or the most common genus around here, Mordella. The next slide, please. And this one is in an impossible to pronounce Hoshi hanamea, I think. So this one is in the genus, it doesn't matter. Hoshi hanananomia, which obviously was originally described, or at least named after Japanese entomologists. So they can actually have a little bit of a pattern too. But all of these beetles are super, super tiny. And if you don't look really closely, then you will probably never see one. So one of the things I like to do at the Nature Center is just sometimes walk around the front lawn or walk around the pocket prairie and just do this. Just go really close to the flowers. If I see a little tiny dot on the flower, sometimes I have to use my phone to magnify it, but I go up and I see what it is. Sometimes it's just some weird fly that I'm never going to identify, and then sometimes it's one of these guys. Next slide, please. And that's another close-up picture. You can see that little stylus that sticks off the end of the abdomen, and that's what they go. They can do it like this or like that, and they'll rocket themselves off and just sort of tumble down into the grass. The tumbling flower beetles. Next slide, please. Oh, well, now we'll get to the butterflies. And what I did promise is that every time I mention a butterfly, I want to help you bring these butterflies to your yard, not just by giving you the correct nectar sources, but by letting you know what they lay their eggs on. So if you really want to attract certain butterflies to your yard or to the area, you have to give them something to lay their eggs on, and then they grow up there and they go through metamorphosis and they hatch out in your yard. So you have the whole life cycle right there, and they get established in that area, and so awesome, right? Okay. So this is the red admiral, and the red admiral, most of the butterflies we're going to look at feed on a wide variety of flowers, right? And so if you're providing a lot of different kinds of flowers, awesome, you're going to get most of these butterflies. But I want you to be able to provide the larval host plants, the things they lay their eggs on. So red admirals lay their eggs on nettles and false nettles. Good luck getting that at Buchanan's. Next slide, please. And this is the Serranus blue, which is a small blue butterfly. And of course, when it closes up, next slide, please, it doesn't look very blue at all. They're related to the hair streaks, tiny little butterfly, and they lay their eggs mainly on woody legumes. There's a woody legume right over there, by the way. What's really, really popular with a lot of these creatures is partridge pea. That one comes up again and again and again with legumes that butterflies lay their eggs on. So partridge pea is just absolutely great. So partridge pea, wild indigos, cassia, and mesquite, they will lay their eggs on. Next slide, please. Really common butterfly in this area, the common buckeye. The common buckeye lays its eggs on plantago, ruellia, cudweed, toadflax, and false foxgloves. Next slide, please. Anybody know what that is?
It's a Phaon crescent.
You guys are close. It's the pearl crescent. I think that's the pearl. And they usually lay their eggs on different species of asters. And I mean the genus aster. But they will also lay on some other things in the composite family, but they really like smooth-leaved asters. So, we have a couple in this area, or at least in this county, that you can plant. But things that are closely related to the asters that are even within that little, do you guys know much about the Compositaceae, the Asteraceae? It's a mess. So it is just divided and subdivided, but things that are closely related to the genus Aster. Next slide, please. Oh my goodness, guys. There's more pearl crescents right there, just to show you how different they can all be from each other. There's a lot of variety in how intense the oranges are and whether there's a yellow marks and stuff like that, but you have to look for certain spots on certain wings. Next slide, please. And there's, yeah, that's the Phaon crescent. So that's the Phaon crescent right there, and Phaon crescents, again, we're looking at tiny butterflies right here. They lay their eggs on frog fruit, one of my favorite plants. I love it as a ground cover. It does die back during part of the year, but they love laying their egg. Wherever you get frog fruit, you're gonna get these. They're just gonna find you. And I have a lot of these laying eggs in my own yard. I don't realize they're doing it, and then all of a sudden, boom, Phaon crescents everywhere. Next slide, please. Now this one is one that, again, I have noticed within the past 10 years, maybe really even more 5, all of a sudden, boom, Texan crescents exploded in the Houston area. Every season for the past 5 years, they're all over the place. If you have red shrimp plant in your yard, these guys will lay their eggs on things in the acanthus family. They like Justicia a lot. They love that genus. And so, what are some other things in that family? The acanthus, Justicia and Ruellia. So again, if you can get native Ruellia in your yard, I know sometimes the native one is hard to come by, but you get a lot of things laying their eggs on it and feeding on it. Next slide, please. This is the hackberry emperor, and hackberry emperors lay their eggs on. Next slide, please. This is the tawny emperor, and it lays its eggs on hackberry. Both of them. They look really close to each other, and they both lay their eggs on hackberries. And I know we don't buy hackberry and plant it, but if it's coming in as a volunteer in your yard, honestly, I would leave it. There are a lot of other butterflies that lay, and we're talking about a bunch of moths, a bunch of other butterflies that lay their eggs on hackberry. It is an underrated plant, and it just gets a whole host of other native insects that burrow through the leaves, eat the leaves, burrow into the wood. It's just loaded with insects. And so if you have hackberry, you're feeding a lot of animals. Next slide, please. This right here is probably our most common hair streak in the area. It's called the gray hair streak. And gray hair streaks, another small, relatively small butterfly, and you can see those 2 little tails sticking off. The gray hair streak lays its eggs on mallows and legumes both. What I found is it really likes things in the genus Malva. But it also lays its eggs on clovers and beans too. I know we plant natives here, but if you're growing green beans in your yard, there's a lot of things that will lay their eggs on green beans and different peas and things like that. But that includes actually some of those native peas as well. So like cowpea and butterfly pea and a lot of those kind of trailing vines, hairy pea, what is that, hairy trailing pea, or so it's got something like that. It's not a vetch though, it's something else. I'll have to look it up. But a lot of those native things that have pea or bean in their name, they get a lot of these butterflies too. So the next butterfly then is that's another, I believe, who is that? Oh, I know who that is. This is the dusky ground streak. Dusky ground streak. It's another really small butterfly. And next slide, when it opens up, it looks kind of like that. You can see there on the left. So that's usually what you see. I think that's a female over there on the right. And this is one of those butterflies, as you probably know, in this part of Texas, we're at the northern end of the range of a lot of tropical insects. And so we're just at the very northern part of this insect's range, and it goes all the way down to Venezuela, all through Central America. And so there's a bunch of plants that they lay their eggs on that we just don't have here. They love feeding on leaf matter. So instead of feeding on live plants, these animals lay their eggs on the ground in leaf litter, and their caterpillars eat leaf litter. So if you have some leaf litter on your property, you may be feeding these creatures right here. But they do love to feed on things, on leaves in the cashew family, but we don't have a lot of cashews growing around here. So, but we still get them, so they're obviously eating something else. Next slide, please. We have two ladies. It's ladies' night, everyone. We're going to look at a couple of ladies. This is the American lady, and we get both the American and the painted lady here. American ladies like to lay their eggs on composites, things like pussy toes, everlasting, and ironweed. Next slide, please. And this is the painted lady, very similar butterflies, obviously. They like to lay their eggs on composites also. They like things like sunflowers, thistles, and basket flowers. So keep in mind, when you put out those native seed mixes, there's all these things that are going to eat those that you never even thought about. Next slide, please. The Gulf fritillary, obviously, is a longwing butterfly related to the zebra longwing. And this is in a group called the heliconian butterflies. They lay their eggs on passion vines, that's right. Next slide, please. You guys know that one, right? We don't have to go to that's its own workshop. That's its own talk right there, the monarch butterfly. And as you know, you should plant native milkweeds. Next slide, please. It's not the only milkweed butterfly in our area, though. There's another poisonous milkweed butterfly, the queen, who has more of a burnt orange color, and you don't get all of those black lines across it as much. The queen, again, also lays its eggs on species of milkweed. Next slide, please. This is the question mark butterfly. This has become much more common in our park recently, and we have no idea why, but it's just started really appearing lately. They like to lay their eggs on elm, hackberry, and species of nettle. Next slide, please. I'm going to pick it up a little bit so that you're not here until midnight. Unless you guys want to do that. We could party all night long. This is what a question mark looks like when it closes up its wings. So if it's sitting in a forest and it's closed up, you might never notice it. It just looks like dead leaves. Next slide, please. Now there's a group. These butterflies are really hard to tell apart from each other. And sometimes you got to take a photo and then look for certain marks on it. And these are the checkered skippers. Is this a white or a common checkered skipper? Good question. There's no way you can tell just by looking at a photo. You'd have to have it in hand. The checkered skippers like to lay their eggs on mallows. Now, there's all kinds of non-native mallows, right? And the poppy mallows. I don't know if you guys like desert plants, but that's a really nice one. But one of the things they lay their eggs on that if you just leave it alone as a weed in your yard is Sida. You know that genus? Sida rhombifolia. It's a little native mallow that just kind of pops up. It's a little bit woody. It doesn't grow too tall. I think it's called I think it's like false mallow is what they're called, the false mallows. But you can't buy it, but it just kind of pops up all over the place in little fields all over the place. Next slide, please. We believe that the more common one is this one with a little bit more grayish wash on its wings, the tropical checkered skipper, which also lays its eggs on different species of mallow. Next slide, please. This is called the clouded skipper, and you can kind of see why it's called that. It's got kind of this cloudy region kind of on the edges of the wings there. I know a lot of us don't care about these little brown butterflies, but I really, really get into looking at the marks on their hind wings and figuring out the different species. Oh, it's got 3 spots there. Ooh. You know, so like, is it a roadside skipper? Is it a clouded skipper? This is probably our most common of the little brown skippers that are hard to tell apart. LBJs, little brown jobs, right? This creature lays its eggs on different grasses. And unfortunately, their favorite grasses are the ones we hate, right, as native plant people. They love St. Augustine, they love Bermuda grass. Basically, if you have any grasses near you that are on a lawn, you're going to get these butterflies. Again, you just might not notice them because they're little brown butterflies. Next slide, please. This is another skipper. This is one of the open wing skippers, so instead of being folded up like this when it lands, they'll often open up. Skippers are in a little group of butterflies, a family called the Hesperidae. So these guys lay their eggs on oak leaves. So I was trying to sell you on hackberries earlier. I can't sell you enough on native oaks, because there's so many things that lay their eggs on oak leaves. They're so productive for insects. So again, this is Horace's dusky wing. It looks very much like another butterfly, very similar, called the Juvenal's dusky wing. And they can be very hard to tell apart in the wild, but in our area, this is the more common one. Next slide, please. This is the fiery skipper, probably one of the most common butterflies in the Houston area, especially in the summertime. A lot of the other butterflies have kind of died back a little bit. They're going through their larval phases or something. These guys have a really fast life cycle, and you'll just see them, as long as it's warm out, you'll see them all over the place. Have you guys been to the Eastern Glades section of Memorial Park? Incredible for insects, great place for native plants, native wildflowers that are just popping up on their own. On summer days, these things will cover the lantana that's out there. They'll just be all over the lantana. And my friend Katie, who works at the Conservancy here, has made sure that those are native lantana. She's been very strict about it. So these creatures, I have to look that one up again. I can't remember. Grasses. This is another one that just lays its eggs on grasses, and it's part of why they're so common. They'll lay their eggs on St. Augustine, Bermuda grass, and a lot of other native grasses. And there are a bunch of little short, unnoticeable native grasses that things lay their eggs on. And so I try to key out the grasses at the Nature Center, but it's really hard to tell some of these small grasses apart from each other. Next slide, please. That is what a fiery skipper looks like when its wings are closed. Next slide, please.
Favorite.
I love this butterfly. And by the way, just because it's brown doesn't mean it's a moth, right? We can get into what makes a moth and a butterfly, but it really is just convention. They're all Lepidoptera, right? They're all in the same group of insects. In different families, we have decided are moths, and then certain groups of families we've decided are butterflies. Butterflies tend to be diurnal. Moths tend to be nocturnal, and we tend to say that if it's got clubs, you see those the thickening at the end of the antennae. If it's got clubs on the end of the antennae, we tend to call them butterflies, and if they have just straight, thin, or feathery antennae without the clubs, we tend to call them moths. So that's why these little brown things are not moths, they are butterflies. This is the, of course, long-tailed skipper. And it's one of my favorites. They lay their eggs on all kinds of trailing legumes. They love my friend Katie, who works here at the Memorial Park Conservancy. When we go to her place out in New Caney, she's got a little farm site. These are all over her green beans. They're just eating all those green bean leaves. You see their caterpillars all over the place. And we get them quite a lot at the Nature Center also. But of course, you can plant a number of native peas and beans. Again, butterfly pea, cow pea, a lot of those other species like that. Next slide, please. The very closely related white-striped longtail lays its eggs on legumes. Let me see if I have a special note about that one. They like to lay their eggs on all the things we just mentioned and mimosas, and that includes the little native mimosas that grow down on the ground that we call sensitive plant. So sometimes they'll lay their eggs on that. Not commonly, but they will. Next slide, please. This is the American snout, and you see why it's called that. These tend to show up in big numbers early in spring, totally disappear from us, and then show up again in the fall. And some of the butterflies that we're looking at do that because of their life cycle. They're less noticeable as caterpillars, and they'll go through their caterpillar stage kind of in the middle of the summer when it's hot, and then they'll kind of emerge as butterflies. They do this, but what's also happening with some of these butterflies is some butterflies are big-time migratory, right? Like monarchs, or some of the big sulfur butterflies. They'll come from thousands of miles away, and they'll fly down through here to go to Mexico, or they'll fly down here to spend the winter. And then some butterflies that were nesting in Oklahoma or Texas will just sort of regionally go and just kind of move a short little distance down here and live out the rest of their lives here. So these will just all of a sudden show up again in the fall, and both things are happening with this butterfly. The duration of their life cycle and some of the ones in the southern part of their range will come down here. The more northerly ones will move a little bit south and then die pretty quickly. But of course these butterflies do better down here because we have mild winters, for the most part. Not 2 years ago, we won't talk about that. So that's the American snout, and the American snout feeds on hackberry. There's another one, right? Next slide, please. Oh, you know what I see American snouts? There's an American snout from the side. They feed on bidens and they feed on a ton of different things. One of the things I've seen them feeding on quite a lot are those little flowers that pop up on red maple. Right before it puts the leaves back out. Have you ever seen the little bitty flowers on red maple? This is one of the few things, I've seen honeybees do it too, but these guys will often be feeding on the red maples. The ones that have survived through the winter, you'll see them feeding really early in the winter on those. Late in the winter, early in the spring. Next slide, please. This is the cloudless sulfur. Usually, if you have a big yellow butterfly in your yard, it's the cloudless sulfur. Not to be confused with the clouded sulfur, which are two different butterflies. The cloudless sulfur famously lays its eggs on legumes, and what's cool about their caterpillars is, so they feed on things in the genus Senna, Cassia. Did I have something else for that? Yeah, so they like partridge pea, cassia, and senna. And if their caterpillars are feeding on leaves, they will be green. But if they move up and start feeding on the yellow flowers, the caterpillar will be yellow. So they'll be the color of the thing that they're feeding on. Next slide, please. This is a small yellow butterfly. It's only about this big. Most of the time, if you have a smaller sulfur or yellow butterfly in your yard, it's going to be the little yellow. They thought a long time about that common name, didn't they? And like most of these creatures, they lay their that are in this group, they lay their eggs on legumes. They especially like the genus Cassia and the genus Senna. Next slide, please. Do any of you grow citrus?
Yeah. Oh, Eastern
Giant.
giant.
The Eastern giant swallowtail. Their caterpillars are great big things, like the size of my index finger right here, and they're often called orange dogs because they will be on orange trees chewing up the leaves. Now, white people were not always in North America growing citrus, right? So what were they doing before? There are native species of citrus, right? Like lime prickly ash. So if you can get a hold of that plant, and you want to be strict about growing native plants, lime prickly ash. A lot of the things that lay their eggs on citrus will do that. Sometimes lime prickly ash shows up at Doremus Nursery. Sometimes I know that they've had it at the plant sale here. It can be a little hard to come by. You need to ask around for it. The Houston Audubon Society might have it sometimes.
Mercer.
Does Mercer have it?
Yeah,
Oh, you do? I suddenly remember you gave me a tour of Mercer once. We'll talk about that later. Next slide, please. Another swallowtail. Now, these butterflies are kind of sad. The swallowtails live about a week or two, and then their bodies just fall apart and they fall over and die. So you find these butterflies dead a lot. They're just not very long-lived butterflies. This is, by the way, a giant swallowtail from the side. So you can see how yellow its body is and how yellow the underwings are. It is going to be one of the larger butterflies that you're going to see in the Houston area. They're about that big, really big butterfly. Next slide, please. We're going to look at the black swallowtails. There are actually 5 species of black swallowtails in the Houston area. We're going to look at 3 of them. So female tiger swallowtails can be black sometimes, quite often, but we don't get those in our park that often, so I'm not going to talk about them. This one is the black swallowtail. So if you have an herb garden or a vegetable garden, you often get these caterpillars on anything that you're growing that's in the carrot family. So they will lay their eggs on dill, parsley, fennel, sometimes rue, strangely enough, which is a very nasty, there's some nasty chemicals in rue. You can actually get contact dermatitis just from touching it sometimes. But they seem to be able to feed on that also. I saw a bunch feeding on bullwort, which is a non-native invasive species that's growing along White Oak Bayou. So what are they laying their eggs on that's native? They're laying their eggs on native chervilles, Tenturier's chervil, if you know that one, and they'll lay their eggs on prairie parsley, which again is not an easy plant to get a hold of, but prairie parsley is a really nice plant where you can get a lot of black swallowtail caterpillars. There's another species that lives in Asia, so we call this one the American black swallowtail, is the official name of this one. Next slide, please. We're not going to talk about identification between these species. You're going to have to get a butterfly book and learn this. But I'm going to tell you what to plant if you want to attract this. This is called the pipevine swallowtail. This is another tropical butterfly that we are at the very northern end of their range up here, although they do go through the southwest up the coast of California a bit too. And of course, pipevine swallowtails lay their eggs on Aristolochia, right? They lay their eggs on. Now again, that's another one. It can be hard to get native pipe vines sometimes. You get that reticulated one, the one that's sold at nurseries a lot, like Buchanan's. And I love Buchanan's. And so you get these guys a lot on both the native species and the one though that you can get available at garden centers. Next slide, please. And the last one is the spicebush swallowtail. The one we didn't mention is the gold rim swallowtail, which is not very common in our area, but it does pop up, the polydamas swallowtail. But this one right here is, and then there's the other one. Okay, but this is the spicebush swallowtail. They like to lay their eggs on spicebush, sassafras, and both sweet and red bay. So if you can find the native red bay, great. But mostly I find Persea bourbonica, right, growing around, which is the one from Europe. But they'll lay their eggs on any of those. And sometimes birds, of course, fly into the park and they poop camphor tree berries down into the park. And we'll get little camphor trees growing up, and I'll go to pull it angrily, and then as I'm grabbing it, covered in caterpillars. So I will leave some of the smaller trees if they've got caterpillars on them, and I'll just tie a little orange ribbon around it and come back and pull the tree later. That's it for the butterflies. It's going to get even more exciting. We're going to look at flies now. This is a good time that if you need to leave, you will not hurt my feelings, because I'm just going over a whole bunch of insects, and it may not be your thing. So everybody, let's take a real quick look at flies. Some of the flies you may get are the really cute, furry little bee flies. This one doesn't have a common name, but we get it a lot at the Nature Center. Sometimes it's called like the black-edged bee fly. Their larvae are parasitic on bee and wasp larvae, so they'll just lay their eggs on the nests of bees and wasps. But as adults, they feed on nectar and pollen. Next slide, please. This one is diabolical. It's got the name the Lucifer or bright bee fly. And so I can't remember what the genus name is, but the species name is Lucifer. And I think it's because it can be bright colored sometimes. And they're parasites, so the adults feed on nectar and pollen, and the babies, the larvae, are parasitic on moths in the noctuid family. The mother will lay an egg on the outside of the chrysalis, and then the baby will burrow in and eat the pupating noctuid moth. Kind of nasty. Next slide, please. A lot of the flies that you think of as landing on dead stuff and then landing on your sandwich also eat nectar and pollen, like the green bottle or blowfly. Next slide, please. There's another blowfly that's very common in this area, and you notice that the eyes are so big that they run into each other right here. This is the oriental latrine fly. I don't know how I feel about one of the words in that name. We need to come up with a better name for that. What would Edward Said say? Next slide, please. That joke wasn't for everybody. And of course, crane flies. Some people call these daddy long legs, but of course, we call daddy long legs the arachnids. So these are crane flies. These are often called mosquito hawks in the mistaken belief that they prey on mosquitoes. They do not. They drink juices from plants. They either drink sap, they'll puncture the side of soft plants and drink the juice out of them, or they'll just feed on nectar and pollen, mostly nectar. But the crane flies are easily recognizable, those two big wings and those long spindly legs, and there's so many species of them, we're not going to get into it. Next slide, please. Some mosquito, now this is a big mosquito, it's about this big. It's almost the size of a crane fly. But this mosquito does not feed on blood, it feeds on nectar. And it's beautiful. It's got green-blue iridescence on it. And this mosquito is your friend. The adults feed on nectar, the larvae are aquatic, and they feed on the larvae of other mosquitoes. This really is a fly that eats mosquitoes right here. It's called the elephant mosquito, and you'll often see them sitting on top of a flower. By the way, I cannot stress enough how great frostweed is. Verbicina, is that the genus? Frostweed, which we have a ton of growing in our park, and it'll often volunteer itself in your yard. Those flowers get covered with things, and I will see these guys sitting on the frostweed quite often, drinking nectar. So big shaggy mosquito called the elephant mosquito. Next slide, please. There's a small group of hoverflies that particularly love visiting flowers. They're often called the flower flies. This one is the margined calligrapher. This is another one you've got to look closely at your flowers. If you're walking by, they love composites, by the way. They love Philadelphia fleabane. Ooh. So I've been wanting to do that in front of a group of people for a long time, sorry. So they love Philadelphia or daisy fleabane, and you'll often see this tiny little thing flying around on the fleabane or whatever composite you have, and it's this tiny little fly, and if you look closely at it, it's a little bit of a bee mimic. I don't know if they're really mimicking bees, but they have some of the yellow and black stripes on them. Next slide, please. There's one up close inside of a flower. Next slide, please. There's a big, thick, fat one. There's a group of big, thick, fat flower flies called plushbacks. This is the tropical plush, or this is the northern plushback here. We have another one that's grayer than this called the tropical plushback, and those are both in the areas. And those are more noticeable. But from far away, it'll just look like a housefly, and when you get up closer, they're actually much more beautiful. And they're feeding on nectar and pollen. Next slide, please. Have you ever seen a little dude like this on your plant eating aphids? So sometimes you'll see this thing and it looks like a caterpillar, but it's eating aphids. I see these on, is it guara or gaura? How do you say it?
Gara.
Thank you, gaura. I win that bet. So that's how it's spelled. So you'll see these on gaura. I have a lot of Lindheimer's bee blossom in my yard, much to the chagrin of other people who live there. And we have a decent amount at the Nature Center, and you'll see these all over those. They'll be on other plants too, but I see these on those, and they're eating aphids. What is this tiny caterpillar? Next slide, please. It's flower flies. So a lot of flower flies, some of these flower flies, their larvae are aquatic. Some of them, their larvae live down in the soil. But this one, and the one we just looked at, they have predatory larvae that look like tiny little caterpillars, and they move around and they eat thrips and aphids and scale insects. So these flower flies are more beneficial in your garden than you realize if you're fighting aphids. So they'll usually be stationed right there on the stem next to where the aphids are, and they'll grab them every day. And then of course further down there's a ladybug and a ladybug larva. So this is another creature that feeds on aphids. Next slide, please. Another species that you'll see sitting on flowers a lot, but it's actually not a pollinator. Have you ever seen these shiny, tiny little green flies? These are called the long-legged flies, and they're actually predatory. So what they're doing is they're waiting for other small creatures to come on. Now they like sitting on leaves nearby, but sometimes they'll sit in the flower and they'll look like they're pollinating, but they're actually not. Long-legged flies are feeding on other insects that are coming to feed on the flowers. And it's almost impossible to tell the species apart. You can usually tell you have the genus Condylostylus or something like that, but they are usually shiny green, sometimes they're bronze, and if you look for the size of the fly, they have these really long legs, even though they're only really, really tiny little flies. This is another thing to look closely at when you're on a flower. I don't know if you personally will be on the flower, but you know what I mean. Next slide, please. You know what these are? Love bugs. And love bugs are actually a species of fly. They're in a group called the march flies. And if you look closely, they only have 2 wings. And if an insect only has 2 wings, it's a fly. It's in the diptera. And so these guys are actually flies. And they're also, now they're not, they'll feed on fruit juice. They'll feed on other plant juices that are leaking, but they'll also feed on nectar. And so you'll sometimes see them on your flowers. And then sometimes they'll just really annoy the hell out of you by dying all over your windshield, of course. Next slide, please. This is another one that I'll often see sitting on a flower, but it's not, I just thought it was pretty, so I wanted to include it. This is the golden-backed snipe fly. Golden-backed snipe fly. They're actually predatory on other flies mostly, and they'll hang out on or near a flower, wait for creatures to come up, and then grab them, kill them, and eat them. We're going to leave the flies now. We're going to go to the moths. We're winding down, guys, don't worry. I love you. So this is one of my favorite tiny little moths, the Ailanthus webworm moth. And if you had been here maybe 50, definitely 100 years ago, you'd almost never see them here. They're more tropical, but they have moved themselves into the southeastern United States because we grow a plant sometimes in our yard called Tree of Heaven. The hated tree of heaven. and they will lay their egg, which is Ailanthus. That's the name of the genus. They'll lay their eggs on Tree of Heaven, and we've started getting these over the past, I'd say, maybe 20 years in the Houston area, as that plant got grown more. Now it's one of those plants people almost never buy, but it just kind of seeds itself in around. Next slide, please. This is something that is really more common in the fall. It's called the white-tipped black moth. And white-tipped black moth lay their eggs on snow on the mountain, snow on the prairie, which I don't know, can you buy those anywhere? Have you ever seen those for sale?
Easy to see them here.
Yeah, and some other euphorbs, they like the genus Phyllanthus, and they like sapote, which is not really native to this area, but they'll lay their eggs on sapote as well. Next slide, please. I've only seen this moth one time at the Nature Center, but I love it, because it's a wasp-mimic moth, and it's really only about that big. I saw one last year, and I just had to share it with you. This is the Florida oak gall borer moth. They lay their eggs on the outside of oak galls, and the baby burrows in and protects itself. Now, what's unclear, is it feeding on the wasp that caused the gall to get formed, or is it just using the gall itself as a cocoon? I couldn't find any information on that, but they emerge from oak galls. So if you have oak trees, you can possibly get these. We're on the kind of far western side of their range, but we do get this species. The Florida oak gall borer moth. Next species, please. This is the red-bordered emerald moth. And I have found these occasionally during the day. Usually I see them at night on the underside of our front porch. And this, the red-bordered emerald moth lays its eggs on oak trees. Again, you got oak trees, you're gonna attract all kinds of stuff. Next slide, please. Now, its close relative, the southern emerald, lays its eggs on different composites. You find there, especially sunflower, Liatris, Rudbeckia, Gaillardia, stuff like that. The shaggier looking, the better. And there's something special about their caterpillars. Their caterpillars love to live up on the flowers and eat the flowers. Next slide, please. And what they will do is they will clip off petals and glue them to their back. Eventually, the petals turn brown, they rot, and they fall off. But if one's living on Liatris, it'll have little purple tufts on its back made out of the Liatris petals. If it's living on one of the yellow composites, it'll have little yellow tufts on its back made out of those petals. They're adorable, and it just kind of inches its way across. Next slide, please. This next one is let's see if I can do this without looking at my notes. I believe is that the grape leaf skeletonizer moth? Let's look. Yes, Eric, it is. It's the grape leaf skeletonizer. There's a bunch of little black diurnal moths that look very similar to each other. Diurnal moth, are you kidding? Yes, some moths come out in the daytime. Feathery antennae, no clubs. And of course, grape leaf skeletonizer, what do they lay their eggs on? Different species of grapes. And of course, we have like 2 or 3 species of wild grape here. And again, if on the edge of your property, let's say you don't have Mustang grape or whatever the muscadine or any of those things, but you do have Virginia creeper, they will also lay their eggs on Virginia creeper. So you're providing a home for these creatures if you're providing Virginia creeper. I just let it grow on the back fence, much to the chagrin of some people. That's at my own house. Next slide, please. This is another moth. You see him at night, you see him in the daytime. Have you ever seen this guy waving his tail around on the front of your house? Sometimes you leave your front porch light on and these creatures will be out. And I'm gonna do a little lewd dance for you in a second. Here we go. So the things sticking out of its back end, those are called corymata. And what they do is they emit pheromones. And so when a male is ready, he pops those corymata out of the tip of his abdomen and he just starts wafting pheromones around. This one right here is called the melonworm moth, which again, if you're trying to grow melons, cucurbits, if you're trying to grow things that are squash or melon related, these can be your bane. They do chew into the stems and the roots and the other part, their larvae eat those. They're very, I think, unremarkable looking larvae. They're just little white grubby looking things. But I think that the adult form is super neat, especially the males when they start waving those things around. And they usually start really doing this actively in late summer and early fall. That's when you see these guys the most active. That's the melonworm moth. They're only about like that big. Next slide, please. This one is called the yellow-collared scape moth, and you get these in spring and then again in the fall. They lay their eggs on grasses, lichens, and spike rushes. And I couldn't find anything better, like I couldn't find what species of grass, so you got grass around, you're gonna get them, I think. Next species, please. Do you know who that is?
Oh, yeah.
Now, you may not know this big sphinx moth that well, but you know its caterpillar, the tomato hornworm. And so the actual adult moth, look how big it is. I think they're gorgeous. It's called I think it's the five-spotted hawk moth or five-spotted sphinx moth. And of course, they don't just eat, even though it's called the tomato hornworm, they're not just found on tomatoes, they're found on virtually anything that's in the nightshade family. So you'll find them on tobacco, you'll find them on peppers, and you'll find them on some of the bull nettles, right? Some of those native nightshades. So if you want to grow them, if you can find a native nightshade, they're sometimes found on datura as well. Next slide, please. This is the other one. We had the tomato hornworm. This is the one that we actually have more commonly in the park, though we've seen both of these feeding at night on various plants. Of course, night feeding pollinators really like white or cream-colored flowers, datura, or different lilies and things like that that have a very musky odor. And so off the top of my head, I can't think of, I know I'm not supposed to admit this, but I have agapanthus in front of my house. And they'll fly up to the agapanthus and feed on it at night. But this is the tobacco hornworm. And when we do grow in our vegetable garden at the Nature Center tomatoes, we don't get tomato hornworm, we get tobacco hornworm laying its eggs on the tomato plants. And that's really what we see them on. And this is the one that you can buy commonly in pet stores to feed to your lizard or something like that too, because they have big fat caterpillars. But this one is also called, the actual moth itself is called the Carolina sphinx moth. And again, native things in the nightshade family. By the way, you can just see the difference there between the tomato and the tobacco hornworm. Great big, like more my middle finger. See, I'm holding my middle finger so as not to offend you. But a great big, thick caterpillar. Very tasty if you're into eating caterpillars. I wouldn't if I were you. And of course, they have that little tail on the end. So usually if you find a big, fat, green striped caterpillar, it's one of these two species. Next slide, please. So the last group of animals we're going to look at tonight, a very underappreciated and often maligned and hated group of animals, of course, the wasps. People ask me all the time, why are there wasps? Wouldn't the world be a better place without wasps? There's no good reason to have a wasp. And it's usually right after they got stung by a wasp, right? But wasps do a lot of pest control in gardens, on crops, in ecosystems in general, right? And they do a lot of pollination. They are so often what they'll do is they'll hunt other creatures to feed to their larvae, but they'll feed on nectar and pollen as adults. Some species feed on both. They're both personally predatory and they feed on nectar and pollen, but they do a lot. So this is one that we've started to get increasing at the Nature Center in the past few years for some reason. It may have something to do with the fact that we brought in a lot of stumps from trees that were chopped down in yards in Bellaire after certain storms happened. And bringing in stumps from the outside has honestly really brought our biodiversity up in the park as far as insects go. We brought in all kinds of larvae and eggs and things we had no idea. This guy is also called, the stump sticker? Stump stabber, that's it. This is one of the giant ichneumon wasps, and she's got that really long ovipositor there. And the ovipositor is what they lay, it's a long tube that they lay their eggs out of. And you'll see them up on a log, and they'll be sticking that ovipositor down into a hole in the log, and what they're looking for is they're looking for sawfly larvae that are burrowing around in the log. And they somehow know that they're there. I don't know if they smell them, I don't know if they know what the holes look like, and they parasitize them. They lay their eggs either near or on, they're called horntails. The horntails are a group of wood-burrowing sawflies. Sawflies are very closely related to wasps. And they'll lay their eggs on them, and of course, as you know, a lot of wasps will lay their eggs on caterpillars and larvae of other things. They leave them alive. And then when the larvae hatch out, they eat the living host, right? So it's like the movie Alien, kind of. So this is one that's become very common, and we see them on flowers. This is the giant ichneumon wasp, the stump stabber. Next slide, please. We also get a lot in the park. We get a lot of different species, but we get what are called mason wasps. And mason wasps will either chew a hole in something, or they will find a pre-existing hole and they'll wall it up with mud. So they'll lay an egg down there, and they'll put their prey down there. And in the case of the four-toothed mason wasp, this large species of mason wasp about this big, they eat pollen, but they sting a caterpillar, and they what do you call it when you can't move? I'm running out of words. They paralyze it with the stinger, but they don't kill it. They put them at the bottom of the cell. They lay their eggs on it. They wall it off with a little wall of mud. They do another one and another one. They hatch out sequentially from the front, by the way. And a lot of wasps will parasitize the prey, lay an egg on it, and when the babies hatch out, they'll eat the living and paralyzed larva of whatever it is, or whatever their prey item is. With this particular one, it happens to be caterpillars. And it's caterpillars for the next one, too. We're going to go off to the next one. This is the fraternal potter wasp. This is another, stings a caterpillar, puts it in its little nest, and then walls it off inside. Now the potter wasp makes a special and cute little nest. Can we go to the next slide? There it is. Oh. The only picture I could find that was good was really faded, but you see they make a little pot with a hole at the top. They actually like form the mud into a little pot, and then through the hole they shove the caterpillar, and they lay the egg on the caterpillar, they shove it in there, and then they wall it off at the top. So we find these on the sides of the Nature Center building a lot, actually. And you know those public restrooms at Anahuac? When you first pull in, these are all over the side of the public restrooms at Anahuac. So look for these if you go out there, especially late in like May and then the summer, if you can stand to be out there when the mosquitoes get horrible and it's really hot. Next slide, please. Another group of wasps that we see visiting a lot. They're very predatory, again, for their babies, but they themselves as adults eat mostly pollen and nectar, are the mud daubers. This first one is called the blue mud dauber. Next slide, please. And the blue mud daubers have nests that look like this. So it'll be one big mud nest with a bunch of cells. They just kind of find loose mud somewhere on the ground, and they go like pick it up in their mandibles, and they come back and they piece together this big nest. And the different kinds of mud daubers have different shaped nests. So this is what the blue mud daubers make. Next slide, please. The next one we're going to look at is the organ pipe mud dauber. You can imagine what its nest probably looks like. Next slide, please. Looks like this. These sort of long tunnels, or these long like rows, and each row has several cells in it, and each cell has a different larva in it. So the mud daubers prey primarily on spiders. They like good-sized spiders, like wolf spiders if they can get them. And they'll, of course, battle the spider. You'll often see them hunting near the ground. And instead of hunting the way that the caterpillars hunters hunt, kind of up in the trees and in bushes, they're hunting on the ground. You'll see them on top of logs, kind of on low, and they're twitching their wings all the time, and they're looking for spiders that are mostly for ground spiders, because they don't want to get tangled up in a web, right? So they're running around, they're looking for loose ground spiders, and then if they can get them just in time and sting them, they paralyze them, put them inside, lay their eggs on them. Next slide, please. This is one we see on the edge of our pond quite a lot. It's the yellow and black mud dauber. And the yellow and black mud dauber, this is, we're almost done. This is the yellow and black mud dauber. You can see her gathering some mud to make her nest. She's another spider hunter. Next slide, please. And they just have a messy, sloppy looking nest like that. Next slide, please. And some of the most hated wasps, because they are the most aggressive towards people, are the paper wasps. These are the eusocial paper wasps. They have a queen, basically, and they have a division of labor. But often if the queen, she's really called a foundress. She's the one who founds the nest, and they make their nest out of gathering plant fibers and leaves, chewing them up, mixing them with saliva. I guess that's what you call it from an insect, or with water. And they make those sort of hexagonal paper nests that you see. Some of the common ones that we have in the area, and again, these are really common pollinators. You see them on flowers a lot, is the dark paper wasp. Next one. The metric paper wasp is very common here. It looks very similar. And the last wasp is one that has moved into the southern and southeastern United States as the climate warms. This has been a recent addition. This is usually considered a tropical wasp found in Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean, and Florida, the very southern tip of Texas, and they've been moving up little by little up through Texas and becoming more common. This is a very small, thin wasp. Again, if you ever go to Anahuac and you go to the public restrooms, they love to build their nest on the sides of the public restrooms at Anahuac. This is called the guinea paper wasp. That's a very problematic name too for a number of historical reasons that we can talk about later. And so those are the wasps. Those are all of our pollinators. And I'm going to end with one last picture that I took. A beautiful little crab spider waiting in some gaillardia for a pollinator to come by. She wants to show her appreciation for pollinators by devouring them. So that's really cool. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Eric. That was fascinating.
Do we have time for questions, or do we need to go?
No